The world had grown quiet after Ragnarok, but silence had never been kind to Kratos. It followed him the way old ghosts followed the dying, patient and unbothered by time. Years had passed since the fires of the 9 realms had cooled, since the last prophecy had been shattered beneath his hands, and since Atreus had walked his own road into distant horizons. Kratos remained. He always remained. He crossed lands no map had ever named, forests where the trees leaned away from him, villages whose people bowed without meeting his eyes. Kingdoms that had once whispered his legend now let him pass in reverent silence, sensing that the Ghost of Sparta no longer sought glory or purpose. He sought distance from gods, from memory, from himself. Yet memory was a companion no blade could sever. Every mile carried the weight of Olympus burning behind him, of Faye's ashes drifting through Midgard's wind, of a boy who had once called him father. His footsteps upon frozen stone sounded like the slow heartbeat of a world that refused to forget him. It was on such a night that he came upon the gate. The mountain pass ended abruptly, as though the earth itself had grown afraid of what lay beyond. There, half buried in black snow, stood a colossal arch of stone darker than any Kratos had known. Its architecture matched no temple of Greece nor hall of the north. Crimson sigils crawled across its surface like veins beneath translucent skin, pulsing faintly, patiently. The air near it did not move. Even his breath, usually a soft cloud in the cold, refused to appear. Kratos approached with the deliberate calm of a man who had long stopped fearing the unknown. His hand rested upon the Leviathan axe. The gate did not react to his divinity, nor to his weapons. It reacted to something quieter, something older within him, the bloodshed carried in his soul, the countless names buried beneath his silence. The sigils flared. Ancient seals cracked with a sound like distant thunder. A swirling crimson void opened where solid stone had stood, and before Kratos could step back, the gateway drew him inward, swallowing him whole. He awoke beneath a moon the color of a fresh wound. The land around him was foreign in a way that unsettled even his hardened heart. Twisted trees clawed at the sky, distant hills bled shadow. And rising above it all impossibly stood a castle so vast it seemed to reshape the mountains cradling it. Towers pierced storm clouds that never moved. Bridges bent against gravity as though gravity itself had lost the argument. Every window glowed faintly, watchful, alive. Kratos rose slowly, studying the fortress the way a hunter studies a beast that has not yet decided whether to strike. Something within its stones stirred. He felt it. The castle was aware of him. He descended into the valley below, where villages waited in perfect stillness. Doors hung open. Meals sat untouched, still faintly warm. Cradles rocked in windless rooms. Yet no bodies remained, only claw marks upon walls and dried blood painted in patterns too deliberate to be accidents. Creatures watched him from the shadows. They did not attack. Some fled. Others simply observed, confused, as though his presence contradicted a law they had always obeyed. Within a ruined chapel he found a lone survivor, a trembling traveler who mistook him for another monster. Kratos said nothing. When beasts came howling through the broken windows, he simply stepped between them and the man, and ended them without ceremony. The survivor did not thank him. He only whispered, voice cracked and hollow, that if the castle feared him, then heaven itself should fear what came next. Far above, within halls no mortal had walked in centuries, ancient bells began to toll. The castle had acknowledged its newest guest, and upon a throne carved from grief and shadow, Dracula opened his eyes and smiled, not from confidence but from curiosity. Kratos entered the castle expecting the familiar rhythm of war, the language of steel and consequence he had spoken all his life. What greeted him instead was a place that did not obey the laws of the world he knew. The doors closed behind him without hands. The torches lit themselves in patient sequence, as though welcoming a guest long expected. The first corridor stretched impossibly long, then folded upon itself when he turned away. Staircases climbed into ceilings and emerged from floors. In one chamber, time itself fractured, and Kratos watched the shades of long-dead warriors relive their final moments over and over, screaming silently into the same walls that had already killed them. He passed them without pity, though something in his chest tightened. He had known too many men who died like this. The castle attacked the mind as often as the body. Whispers slid along his shoulders. Reflections in blackened mirrors moved a moment too late. And still he walked forward, because forward was the only direction he had ever truly understood. The monsters came in waves. Vampires reformed from spilled shadow. Demons rose again from puddles of their own blood. Spirits refused to die by steel alone. Every kill felt like drawing water from an ocean with cupped hands. He began to sense a terrible truth, that the castle grew stronger with every act of violence he committed within it, feeding upon hatred the way a fire feeds upon dry wood. Deep beneath the throne, the vampire nobles gathered in argument. Some demanded the outsider be destroyed at once, before the disturbance spread further. Others, older and wiser, urged restraint. Sensing something they could neither name nor measure, Death listened without speaking. When at last he raised a bony hand, the chamber fell silent. He advised patience. The stranger, he said, carried a destiny not written in their master's book, a fate not born of this castle, a fate that might unmake all of them if provoked without understanding. In the ruins of a burned monastery beyond the eastern walls, Kratos encountered the Belmonts. What remained of them? A handful of hunters, bloodied and wary, who saw the cursed aura clinging to him and drew their weapons before their words. They mistook him for one of Dracula's own, another servant sent to end them. Kratos did not argue. He rarely did. But when the sky split open and demons poured from the clouds, he stood before the hunters and cut a path through the darkness alone, asking nothing in return. Only then did they lower their blades. Only then did they speak. They told him of Dracula, of Matthias's grief, of the cycle that had defined their bloodline for generations. They told him a truth that struck deeper than any wound. Dracula could not truly die. Every age eventually bred enough hatred, enough cruelty, enough despair for the castle to return. The conflict was eternal. Their family had inherited a war that had no ending, only intermissions. Kratos listened in the silence he had perfected over decades, and for a moment something ancient stirred in him. He had spent his life breaking cycles men swore were unbreakable. He had killed pantheons that called themselves eternal. He had watched destiny itself bleed beneath his hands. If Dracula was sustained by fate, then fate too could be murdered. He had done it before. That night, as the crimson moon refused to move across the sky, Kratos stood alone upon a broken parapet, staring at the towers that reshaped themselves whenever he was not looking. He felt watched. He always felt watched here. A cold wind stirred behind him, though nothing physical had moved. He turned. Death stood there, robed in tattered shadow, his scythe resting quietly against his shoulder. He did not raise it. He did not attack. He merely inclined his skull-like head, and when he spoke, his voice carried the calm gravity of centuries. "The master," he said, "wished to meet the man who had murdered fate." Kratos did not answer Death. He merely turned his back on the figure and walked deeper into the castle, choosing the corridors that led away from the throne. Death did not follow. He watched, silent and patient, until the Ghost of Sparta disappeared into the dark. Only then did the Reaper vanish, carrying word to his master that the outsider had refused an audience with a king. The castle responded before Dracula could. Its walls shivered. Its stones exhaled. Somewhere far above, a great and terrible intelligence turned its full attention upon the intruder, and the fortress transformed around him. Where once it had merely wandered, now it hunted. Entire wings unfolded like the pages of a living book, each chamber tailored to a wound Kratos had carried for centuries. The first trial found him in a chamber of red sand. Spartan soldiers rose from the dust, their armor blackened by fire, their eyes hollow with betrayal. They spoke his name the way condemned men speak the name of the god who abandoned them. They accused him of leading them into slaughter for the vanity of kings. Kratos said nothing. He did not raise his axe. He simply walked through them, and one by one they crumbled behind him, unable to strike a man who refused to answer their grief with rage. In the next hall he found her, Lysandra, and beside her, a smaller shadow he could not bring himself to name aloud. They stood at the far end of a corridor that stretched forever, silent, unreachable. He did not run to them. He knew what they were, and the castle, watching from within its own stone, could not comprehend why he did not weep, why he did not scream, why he did not burn the world for the chance to touch them again. It did not understand that he had already done all of those things, and none of them had brought them back. Zeus came next, then Odin, then Balder, laughing that same broken laugh. Illusions of every god he had ever killed, whispering that surrender to rage would be so easy, so familiar, so kind. Kratos closed his eyes, and when he opened them, the illusions were gone because he had refused to feed them. The castle grew unsettled. Its magic, built upon the certainty that every warrior could be broken by the mirror of his own sins, faltered against a man who had already looked into that mirror and walked away. Somewhere in the highest tower, Dracula leaned forward upon his throne, fascinated. This intruder was not simply strong. He had evolved beyond the shape of the men Dracula had spent centuries destroying. Death, meanwhile, moved through the deeper halls, summoning champions. He gathered generals older than kingdoms, creatures that had drunk the blood of saints, warriors who had never known defeat. He knew now that the castle itself was compromised, and that if the outsider was not stopped, the fortress would begin to fear its own master. Kratos met the first of these champions in a cathedral of shattered glass. A vampire lord ancient beyond memory, whose armor bore the crests of 100 slain Belmonts. The creature moved like smoke given hunger, its wounds sealing before blood could fall. In another life, Kratos would have met it with fury. In this life, he watched. He studied its rhythm, the pattern of its regeneration, the faint tremor in its magic whenever moonlight struck it directly. He fought with patience instead of wrath. He led the creature beneath a shattered dome, where the crimson moon poured down like judgment, and there, in that pale and terrible light, the vampire's magic could not knit itself whole. Kratos ended it with a single, deliberate strike. News of the death traveled faster than any messenger. For the first time in centuries, one of Dracula's immortal commanders had truly fallen, and deep beneath the castle's foundations, ancient seals began to crack. Something older than Dracula stirred in the dark. The castle was no longer merely reacting, it was afraid. Kratos descended. He did not know why the lower halls called to him, only that the castle had stopped resisting his passage. Doors that had once shifted now waited open. Staircases that had twisted now lay straight. It was as though the fortress, wounded and uncertain, wished for him to see what its master had spent centuries hiding. He came at last to a sanctum untouched by war. No banners, no thrones, only shelves of ancient books, portraits draped in dust, and a great stone table upon which rested a single leather-bound journal. The air here did not feel cursed. It felt tired, grieving, human. Kratos opened the journal. The name written upon the first page was not Dracula. It was Matthias Kronkvist. He read slowly, the way a man reads a letter from someone he might have been, of a scholar who had loved his wife more than heaven itself, of prayers offered on his knees for her healing, of the moment those prayers were answered with silence, and the moment silence was answered with rage, of a faith that did not simply break but inverted, turning upward into a blade aimed at the very throne that had abandoned him. Kratos closed the journal and did not move for a long time. He knew this man. He had been this man. Both had lost families. Both had knelt in the ash of everything they loved. Both had raised their voices against heaven and demanded answers no god was willing to give. The parallels were not comfortable. They were unbearable. And yet, somewhere in the deepest chamber of his heart, Kratos understood that the crucial difference between them had not been strength, nor cunning, nor even divinity. It had been a choice. A small, quiet choice made 1,000 times over 1,000 mornings, to live despite the loss, to carry it rather than become it. Dracula had made the other choice. He had chosen to preserve his hatred as a monument, a shrine to the world that had taken everything from him, and around that shrine a castle had grown. Kratos left the sanctum with the weight of the journal still heavy in his mind. He understood now why death served without question. It was not fear, it was reverence. Death admired his master for refusing to bow to destiny, for turning grief into empire, for building an eternity out of a single unhealed wound. Death had seen countless kings kneel to fate. Only Dracula had refused, and Kratos, who had spent his life learning to bow to nothing, found himself wondering if defeating this man could ever truly end the cycle. To kill Dracula was simple. He had killed greater. But to end what Dracula represented, the refusal to let grief become memory, was a war no blade could win. High above, within a chamber lined with enchanted mirrors, Dracula watched him. He had watched for days. He had studied the intruder's silence, his restraint, the way he passed through visions of his dead without shattering, and slowly, terribly, Dracula recognized something he had not felt in centuries: recognition. Here was a man who had walked a road almost identical to his own, who had lost as much, who had raged as fiercely, who had killed as many gods. And yet somewhere upon that road, the stranger had turned, not away from his pain, but through it. Dracula did not understand turning. He wished to understand it. For the first time since his beloved's death, he did not desire conquest. He desired conversation. He rose from his throne. He dismissed the war councils gathered in silence around him. He sent word to the vampire nobles that no further armies would march. He silenced the war drums that had beaten beneath the castle for centuries. Death protested quietly once and was refused. Dracula would meet the outsider himself, not as king, not as monster, but as one broken father at long last willing to look another broken father in the eyes. They met in a chamber that had once been a chapel before the castle had swallowed the meaning of such places. The stained glass was long shattered, but shards of it remained upon the floor, catching the crimson moonlight in fragments that looked almost like prayer. Dracula stood at the far end of the ruined nave. He did not wear a crown. He did not carry his blade. He was tall and pale and weary, and his eyes, when they met Kratos' own, held no hunger. Only the deep, patient sorrow of a man who had outlived every reason he had ever been given to live. Kratos entered without weapons drawn. He had come to listen, though he did not yet know why. Their voices, when at last they spoke, were low, deliberate, unhurried. There was no threat between them. Only two histories laid quietly upon the same altar. Dracula spoke first. He spoke of humanity, of the centuries he had watched it repeat itself, of the cruelty that returned in every generation, no matter how many saints preached against it. He had seen mothers burn other mothers for the crime of praying differently. He had seen children raised to hate before they could speak. Hope, he said, was a beautiful lie humanity told itself to make the next atrocity easier to bear. He had lived long enough to know that the wheel would always turn and always crush the same faces beneath it. Kratos listened. Then he answered, slowly, in the low voice of a man who had learned every word by paying for it. Hope, he said, was not something the world gave. It was not discovered lying in the ruins of a burned home, nor found in the sky after a prayer. Hope was built, chosen, carried. It was the small decision made each morning to remain when remaining was harder than dying. He had not found hope. He had made it, with hands still stained by everything he had done. Dracula smiled faintly. It was not cruel. It was tired. Neither man convinced the other. Perhaps neither had ever truly expected to. Yet something passed between them in that chamber, a mutual recognition, a mourning for the versions of themselves that might have chosen differently. The conversation might have ended there in a fragile and imperfect peace. Death did not permit it. He appeared without sound, and his voice, when it came, was cold as an unlit tomb. His master's hesitation, he said, threatened everything they had built. The castle required its king. And if the king would not act, the servant would act for him. He raised his scythe, and the ancient rituals awoke. The castle answered. Reality itself began to fracture. The walls of the chapel dissolved into the sky. The horizon peeled backward. The castle, no longer content to occupy a single valley, began to merge with the outside world, spilling its cursed geometry into kingdoms that had never known its name. Villages Kratos had passed only days before vanished beneath a night that no dawn could reach. Belmont hunters, scattered across the land, were overwhelmed one by one, their beacons of prayer snuffed like small candles beneath a black tide. Word reached Kratos, as word always did, of those who now believed the outsider had brought the apocalypse rather than opposed it. The guilt settled onto his shoulders in the way old armor settles onto old wounds. He had heard this accusation before in Greece, in Midgard, in every land his shadow had ever crossed. He began to wonder if every world he entered was destined to burn behind him. Dracula, at the center of it all, closed his eyes. He did not wish to embrace his full power. He truly did not. But death's ritual had already been sung, and the castle now demanded its master rise to meet what he had summoned. Reluctantly, sorrowfully, he opened his arms to the darkness he had spent his life carrying. The castle began to transform into something older than legend, older than fear, older than the first prayer ever spoken into the dark. The final battle did not begin with a signal. It began with a breath, and then the world came apart. Every layer of the castle woke at once. The lowest crypts rose, the highest spires bent. Chambers that had existed only in memory reasserted themselves upon reality. The sky above the fortress folded into a great crimson eclipse, a wounded eye watching everything beneath it. Storms of ash rolled across the valleys. The stars themselves seemed to flinch. Kratos fought differently than he had ever fought before. He did not fight as the Ghost of Sparta. He did not fight as the killer of gods. He fought as the man he had spent the last years of his life struggling quietly and painfully to become, a protector, a guardian standing between the darkness and those who could not stand for themselves. His axe rose and fell not in fury, but in purpose. His shield turned aside not to preserve himself, but to shelter another. The Belmont survivors fought beside him. So did strangers he had never met, hunters and villagers and monks who had risen from the ruins of their broken homes. And then, impossibly, so did others, vampires. Ancient nobles who had watched their king unravel and could no longer bear the cost of his despair. They turned upon their own kin, and their fangs, for the first time in their long lives, tasted the blood of those they had once called family. Loyalty, they had discovered, was not the same as obedience. Death met them at the threshold of the inner sanctum. He was terrible in a way that few things in any world had ever been terrible. He was patient. He was inevitable. His scythe cut through stone and prayer alike, and he moved with the calm of something that had ended more lives than history could remember. He did not hate the intruders. He did not fear them. He simply believed, with the unshakable certainty of an old and faithful servant, that his master's world was worth defending against any philosophy that threatened it. Kratos met him at the top of a long, broken stair. Their battle was the quietest of the war. Few words, few cries. Only the rhythm of a scythe against an axe, and the slow, deliberate erosion of a devotion that had lasted longer than kingdoms. Kratos did not seek to humiliate him. When at last death fell to one knee, his scythe fractured, his cloak whispering into ash, Kratos did not strike the final blow. He simply walked past. The message was clearer than any killing. Unquestioning loyalty had ended tonight. Something else would have to take its place. Beneath the crimson eclipse, upon a shattered terrace at the summit of the castle, Kratos at last confronted Dracula. Their battle was equal parts steel and sorrow. Every strike carried the weight of a lifetime. Dracula fought with the grief of 1,000 years. Kratos fought with the grief of 1,000 mornings that had followed his own worst night. Their weapons met like arguments. Their silences struck harder than their blows. Neither truly sought to kill the other. Each sought instead to prove that his understanding of suffering was the truer one. Dracula, that pain was proof the world deserved punishment. Kratos, that pain was proof the world still deserved to be carried forward. They fought until the terrace cracked beneath them. They fought until the eclipse itself trembled. They fought until, at last, Dracula fell. His blade knocked from his hand, his cloak scattered around him like the wings of a great and broken bird. He looked up at the man standing above him, and he waited for the blow he had waited for across centuries. Kratos did not deliver it. He lowered his axe. He looked down upon the ruined king, and he offered him the one thing no enemy had ever offered him in his long and terrible life, a choice. The word was quiet. It should not have been powerful, but it struck Dracula more deeply than any weapon ever forged. His hand trembled where it lay upon the broken stone, his eyes, ancient and tired, filled with something he had not felt in centuries. Not gratitude, not defeat, recognition of a road not yet closed. The castle felt it before its master could speak. The stones exhaled. The crimson light began to soften. The vast, terrible engine of hatred that had sustained the fortress for so long began at last to falter, because its foundation had been withdrawn. Hatred could not sustain a master who had been given, however briefly, the possibility of another path. Victory did not arrive through vengeance. It arrived through mercy. And mercy in that broken chamber proved older than any curse. The castle did not fall in fire. It did not collapse in thunder. It simply began, slowly and quietly, to let itself go. Towers softened at their edges, as though remembering they had once been only stone. Bridges unbent from their impossible angles and settled into ordinary curves before dissolving into the wind. The crimson eclipse above the valley opened at last into a pale and honest dawn, the first true dawn that land had known in longer than any living memory. Some of the monsters vanished with the darkness. They had been born of hatred, and without hatred to feed them, they slipped away like frost beneath the sun. Others remained. They wandered from the crumbling halls into the open air, blinking as though they had forgotten what light looked like. A few knelt, a few wept. A few walked into the ruined villages and began, without instruction, to clear the debris. The castle had made them what they were. It had not decided what they would become next. The Belmont survivors gathered upon the broken parapets and looked out across the changed valley. Their hands, which had held weapons for generations, felt strange without them. Their eldest spoke first. They would not be hunters anymore. They would be keepers of memory, of warning, of the small and stubborn hope that had brought them through the longest night of their bloodline. Their war was over. Their vigil had only begun. Kratos did not stay for the ceremonies. He never had. He moved through the fading halls in silence, gathering nothing, claiming nothing. He passed the chamber where he had read Matthias's journal, and he left it undisturbed. Some sorrows, he had learned, were not meant to be carried away by strangers. Before he left, he found Dracula waiting for him at the edge of the collapsing terrace. The vampire king was smaller now, somehow, not weaker, simply less armored by the centuries. He stood without a crown, without a cloak of shadows, and looked at Kratos the way one traveler looks at another upon a crossroads at dusk. They spoke briefly. Neither claimed victory. Neither offered forgiveness, because forgiveness was a currency too heavy for either of them to spend lightly. They spoke instead of grief, of how it never truly left, of how it settled into the marrow and made itself a home. One learned in time whether to carry it or whether to be carried by it. The difference was small. The difference was everything. Kratos turned to go. Dracula did not follow. He watched him walk toward the far edge of the world, and for the first time in centuries, the castle behind him did not whisper suggestions in his ear. The silence, at last, was his own. At the end of the valley, another gateway waited. It had not been there the day before. Its stone was pale, its sigils unfamiliar, its light a color Kratos had never seen in any realm he had walked. He did not know which world lay beyond it. He no longer expected to know before he stepped through. The gates had chosen him once already. He suspected they would keep choosing him for a long while yet. He looked back only once. The castle was gone. Where its towers had stood, there was only the soft gold of morning upon empty hills. Somewhere within that emptiness, he hoped, a man was learning how to live again. Kratos stepped through the gateway. Behind him, in a place no map had ever named, beneath ruins the castle itself had never touched, an ancient relic began to glow. Its light was not crimson. It was not shadow. It was something older and cleaner and stranger than either. A voice moved within that light, patient and vast, speaking to no one and everyone. The Ghost of Sparta had left this world, it said, but the multiverse now knew his name. Somewhere beyond the horizon, another sky waited to be broken open. Another legend waited to feel the weight of his shadow. Another world, unknowing, had already begun to dream of the stranger who would soon walk into its darkest hour. And Kratos, as always, kept walking.